Hello everyone, Bruce Bolton here again, bringing you part 2, our second video in our instructional guide to how to play When There Were 7 Kingdoms. In today's video we'll be talking about describing, giving examples of the basic game pieces, or counters as they will be known in the rules and in descriptions, and giving a more in-depth, detailed explanation of how a player earns victory points and how a player wins the game. So let's dive right into it today. We start off with some examples of a ruler and lord counters. The ruler and lord counters are the key counters needed to move your armies throughout the map and conquer other territory from other players and defend your territory from being conquered. In the game, each player will get one king or queen or ruler counter and 2 lord counters to control their armies. The ruler counter is a generic counter for each player with their family name, a little crown symbol, and family crest. The example here being the Stark ruler counter. The next 2 rows are a variety of lord counters, one from each of the major 7 households. The middle row gives us examples of House Stark, Arryn, and Durrandon lords, followed on the bottom by Martell, House Hoare, Lannister, and Gardner generals, lords. All the lord counters are exactly the same. They have 2 ratings in the yellow boxes. Their family name and the family shield is merely for flavor and color to the game. There really is no difference that any player's lord counter has from any of their other lords. They're all exactly the same. It's just a matter of variety for, make the game a little more colorful and interesting. So each of the lords have 2 values on the lower part of the counter. On the left-hand side is the number 1. This is their battle rating. They get to add 1 die to any land battle that's being fought between them and an enemy player. And the number 6 in the right-hand side represents the maximum number of land strength points, not counters, that they can control at any one point. They can have up to 6 strength points in the battle. That can be a variety of counters, but the strength point value of those counters cannot be greater than 6. Now you notice that the ruler counter doesn't have a battle rating or a command rating on the counter itself, because there's a variety of possible rulers each player may get, and it's not known. It's a random determination. The card that you draw will list their battle rating and their command rating on the card. So to make it simplicity, you just have to make a refer back to the card and not the counter itself for those particular pieces of information. Moving on, we have an example of land units, or counters. We have 5 examples here for houses Stark, Arryn, Lannister, House Durrandon, and House Gardner based on their family's colors. The counter strength points are going to be in either denominations of 1, 2, 4, and 6. It will always be those types of denominations. There's not going to be an odd, there's not going to be strength 3, there's not going to be strength 5 or 7 counters. And you have a finite number of these counters that you can use in the game. If you have all your strength counters on the map, you can't raise or make use of any more. Each of the families, only so many men, so much equipment and arms that they can produce. So now you notice that the House Gardner counter looks different from the other 4 shown here. The first 4 have a black bar on the bottom of it. This represents them being regular soldiers, basically families and people from their lands that are fighting for them. The House Gardner counter, without the black bar, represents sellswords. Sellswords are easier and cheaper to raise than regular troops, but they have the downside is that there are several cards in the deck that either remove sellswords from the game, or even worse, steal them away from a player and give them to another. Because let's face it, they're just mercenaries, sellswords. They're only loyal to themselves and their coin, not to the families they're really fighting for. So, while it's easier to get sellswords, they are a little more risky to use. So it's up to you as the player to determine how you want to spend the effort to raise your troops and make your own armies. After the land units, we have an example of sea units, a naval squadron. Here, a Stark naval squadron. All the naval squadrons will look the same, with the difference being that obviously the family name and the family color background would be different on them. So that's pretty much an example of them. As to the details of the naval stuff, we'll get to that in a later video. Here we have an example next of utility counters, a variety of them that would be placed on the map throughout the course of the game. On the top row we have a diplomatic counter for House Arryn and their diplomatic efforts to become allies with Braavos. Next up is the House Gardener Victory Point, or VP, counter that keeps track of how many victory points they've earned in the game. Then there's the House Horse Harrenhal counter. They're the only ones who get this counter. This represents the amount of construction points that they have put into the construction of the great Harrenhal castle. Once it gets to a certain point, Harrenhal is actually built and can be used throughout the game. Next row we have the Stark RP, or Resource Point counter. Resource points are useful for either buying victory points if you collect so many resource points. But their most common use will be certain cards in the game require the expenditure of resource points. You have to have them available to make use of the card's event, and we'll go into that in greater detail in the next video describing cards and how they're played. Then we have the turn track counter, keeping track of what turn it is throughout the game, 9 turns in the game. Then a pillage counter, so you would use this if you had raided an opponent and did damage to their lands. You put that on the map. In the bottom row we have a bonus VP counter. This one representing the Master of Essos event. If a player has this card in his hands and meets the requirements and plays the card for the event, they gain themselves a one-time 3 victory points. And then the House Stark key location counter, which we will describe in more detail right now, well, momentarily. We'll first do an example of how these counters would be used and placed on the game map itself. Here, looking at this portion of the map, we see most of the counters in play. In the bottom right-hand side, the turn marker is on the turn 1 space of the turn track. Really can't see the rest of it at the moment, sorry about that, but it's turn 1. At some point probably at the end or late in turn 1. And if we look at the record track in the upper right-hand corner, we see some of these counters have been used. House Hor has clearly put 2 points of construction into Harrenhal. The Arryns have put 6 points of diplomatic pressure into becoming allies with Braavos. The Starks have amassed 8 resource points, and House Gardener is sitting right now at 12 victory points. Now all players would have their VP totals on the record track right at the beginning of the game. I just use only one of them right now for this example of the counter use. And if we look on the left-hand side, we see that someone has somehow managed to raid Last Hearth and put a pillage counter on there. We'll go into pillage and what effect that has in the game later on in future videos. Now let's move on to victory points and how players basically win the game. There are 2 methods. Either A player has achieved an automatic victory, or the game has ended on turn 9 most likely, and whoever has the highest number of victory points wins the game. We'll be using House Stark as an example throughout this explanation of VPs. It's the very beginning of the game, and the House Stark player has drawn a ruler from their leader deck, and they got King Osric the Fair. He is their ruler at the moment. He has a battle rating of 1, so he gets to add 1 die to combat, and a command rating of 8, so slightly better than the lords he commands from the earlier counter examples. He doesn't draw any bonus cards during the draw phase, but he can save an additional card at the end of the turn, and he's got that little special ability as well when the turn ends. Now, at the beginning of the game, the Stark player would take all 11 of their key location counters and put them on the map, as we see here. All 11 of them are currently down. So how do we use these? So we look at the map, and the Stark player sees at the beginning of the game that they control 5 key location spaces. These are the square spaces on the map, the most important spaces on the map. Beginning of the game, the House Stark player controls Deepwood Motte, Carhold, the Dreadfort, White Harbor, and the capital of the North, Winterfell. So the House Stark player would take his key location counters and place one of them on each of these square places, so that afterwards the map would look like this, with the counters being placed on all of them. So, and other players would do this similarly for their locations that they control. So afterwards, the Stark battle map now would look like this, with the 5 counters placed down. We see that what that means for the House Stark is that during their draw phase, they will draw 4 cards from the play deck, and controlling those 5 locations gives them 10 victory points. Obviously, if they lost control of a key location, they would put one of their counters back on the map, and obviously they will draw less cards and they'll have less victory points. So the more counters you put down on the map for taking control of other players' locations gives you more VPs and lets you draw more cards. So here's the further example. Now, if House Stark player managed to put down all 11 of their key location counters, you see that they win an automatic victory. This is pretty tricky to do, so not the most common way to win. But if they manage to pull that off, then as soon as they put that last counter down, the game ends and they're declared the winner. Now, if no one does that, then at the end of the turn 9, wherever how many counters they have placed down will obviously, as you see, give them so many victory points and allow them to draw so many cards throughout the game. So the more locations you control, the more victory points you get. Now, the game does allow you to earn bonus victory points, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner, through card play and the expenditure of resource points, and you would put counters down in that little box, and you would add that to your total VP based on your location control, and that will give you the grand total of victory points your house has earned. You would compare this to other players at the end of the game, and whoever has the most victory points is the winner. It is possible for a tie to occur. If there is a tie through victory points, it would be based on who has the most locations controlled. So, hope that gives you a better idea of what it takes to win the game. You have to go out there and conquer other players and get their key location victory spaces away from them and hold on to your own. Only through conquest can you take a key location space. You can't be traded. 2 players can't make a bargain and say, hey, I'll give you control of Deepwood Motte if you do whatever for me. So it's conquest or nothing here. So there is diplomacy in the game, but no lords giving away their territory. So I hope that's a little clearer on how one wins the game. If you have any questions on any of the aspects discussed in this video, you can post them to our group page on Facebook, or you can post a comment here on YouTube underneath, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And hopefully we'll have another video late this week. This third video will discuss the cards in the game and their use, cards being the way that you take actions and play the game. It's very important. So that'll be the next video, and until then, take care, and I hope you've enjoyed this part 2 of our game instructions.